Welcome to Woodbury Writes podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Carlson, and I'm here today with John Opalenik. John has released 4 books, including the novellas The Primeval and The Primeval 2, and The Blue Beneath the Mountain and Among the Willows and Other Strange Tales, a collection of horror, Western short stories. John is an active member of the Horror Writers Association. And outside of writing, he's a teacher and lives with his wife, their dog Zoe, and their son Ben. His books are available either online or in person through Riverbend Bookshop in Glastonbury and West Hartford, Connecticut, as well as on Amazon. John, thank you for joining us today for this conversation on how to get into horror writing or reading horror if that's not your genre and you're not going to go to your Stephen King novel as your first stop. So I'm excited to explore some titles that you find worthwhile in this genre that is your specialty. Thanks for joining me this morning.
Yeah, happy to be here. And even people who like horror, maybe enjoy horror films, but are not really sure where to start in the genre as far as reading goes. Happy to talk about it. Especially, it is such a there's such versatility and there's such a range within the genre, and that's what some of the books I'd like to talk about kind of puts out there, that there's a lot to choose from.
There is, and as a fellow educator, I can appreciate kids love that stuff. But sometimes there's a hesitation. Is it literature? Is it the good stuff that kids should be reading? So I know we're going to touch on that it is quality writing and it's thoughtfully done and has groundings in the literary art. So why don't we get rolling, and shall we start with the middle grade text that you're recommending first?
As a teacher of middle grade readers, I am a lot of horror fans, you're right, and a lot of people think that you've got goosebumps and scary stories to tell in the dark and that's about it, but there's a lot out there, including the book that I'd like to talk about is called Hide and Seeker by Daka Herman. I'll just give the official synopsis and then I'll just give my 2 cents and we can chat about it a bit. Justin knows that something is wrong with his best friend. Z went missing for a year, and when he came back, he was different. Nobody knows what happened to him. At Z's welcome home party, Justin and the neighborhood crew play hide and seek, but it goes wrong, very wrong. One by one, everyone who plays the game disappears, pulled into a world of nightmares come to life. Justin and his friends realize this horrible place is where Z had been trapped. All they can do now is hide from the seeker. So it's so this is a middle grade novel. It's got a strong kids on bikes, Stranger Things feel to it, but it is set in the modern day, and it does tackle real themes. Like the character Z had gone missing for a year and returned unable to really talk about where they've been, covered in scars, and the main character Justin suffers with anxiety, and those themes are covered in a nice nuanced way where it doesn't become the one note that defines the character. It's just something that Justin deals with as he tries to get out of this situation and then solve it. And it's a lot of fun, really. If you like Stranger Things, which very popular right now, it's got a very similar feel to it without being a copy. And I found out recently that this is part of not quite a series, but there will be more books with similar vibes coming from Daka Herman.
And it sounds like it touches on those traditional themes of friendship and courage. And I'm intrigued by your description and your thoughts about it, John. There's also this idea of knowing somebody who looks like they've been through something, and that's huge. How do you work through that as a friend? And what sense do you make of what your friends are going through?
Definitely. And it has a nice cast of characters where you've got the neighborhood bully who's, maybe a little bit of a jerk about it. And you've got the friends who, they're friends with Justin and Z, but maybe they're not as close, and they have that more superficial, like, oh, I don't know. And then there's that more insightful, Justin is a very introspective character, and he's thinking Z doesn't want this welcome home party, but his mom kind of just is sort of forcing normal on him, is kind of making him want to feel normal. And yeah, it touches on that in a really interesting way. And it's just a fun, exciting book. There's lots of twists and turns, mysteries revealed with each chapter. I can kind of imagine each chapter being an episode of a TV show, and it's very well paced.
One of the great things about books at that level is that they are paced to keep you hooked, and I enjoyed just finding out what's going to happen next. That sometimes the plot does drive the reading for a kid, even as the characters are becoming more and more complex. I already want to know, where was Z? So thank you for Hide and Seek by Daka Herman. What's next on your list, John?
So now we're moving up into the world of YA, and we've got Clown in a Cornfield by Adam Caesar. I'm just going to say this close to the beginning of the episode. If I have unintentionally butchered anyone's name, I am sorry for that. Let me know, and I will pronounce it correctly in the future if I find out otherwise. So, Clown in a Cornfield. Quinn Maybrook just wants to make it until graduation. She might not make it till morning. Quinn and her father moved to tiny, boring Kettle Springs to find a fresh start. But ever since the Bay Pen corn syrup factory shut down, Kettle Springs was cracked in half. On one side are the adults, who are desperate to make Kettle Springs great again, and the other side are the kids, who want to have fun, make prank videos, and get out of Kettle Springs as quick as they can. Kettle Springs is caught in a battle between old and new, tradition and progress. It's a fight that looks like it will destroy the town until Friendo, the Bay Pen mascot, a creepy clown in a pork pie hat, goes homicidal and decides that the only way for Kettle Springs to grow back is to cull the rotten crop of kids who live there now. This is sort of like a slick, modern slasher. I guess if I were to compare it to a movie series, I would say Scream. It's billed as YA. Adults can definitely enjoy it too. It's interesting reading it as an adult, thinking, oh, in these moments, I'm actually kind of identifying with the father character a bit more, or the various adults in town. It really gives almost no character in this book is one note. There's depth, there's motivation. There isn't the mustache twirling villain who is bad just to be bad. Adam Caesar writes teenagers very authentically, in that sometimes they can be kind of annoying, but also that's not their one note, and they're not caricatures. And a lot of them are introspective enough to know, like, oh yeah, this kid in class is being a jerk, but whatever. It's one thing I will say about the first book in this series. It's there is a sequel, as all good slashers. There's a sequel. Clown in a Cornfield 2, Friendo Lives. And there is a third book in the works and a movie on the way. So you can really get in on the ground floor of this. And you could be the person who read the book before the movie came out.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, one thing I will say is the first book is a bit gory. It's definitely, if I imagine the movie, when it does come out, will be R-rated if it sticks to the book. But again, it's YA, but that is there. So,
and it sounds like the conflict of tradition versus progress, and divided communities is something that any age group at this juncture in our history can identify with, and maybe see how the book rehearses possible solutions.
Oh, definitely. And it's and it really sets that up in the first book. The sequel takes it even further with the whole the narrative of what really happened in the events of book one, and and it's sort of our people not even being able to come to terms with objective truth. which is something that, you know, people in the young adult audience, they see what's going on, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who will see parallels to the world that inspired this book and this book. But at the same time, it is a slasher. The clown mask going through the cornfield. I was actually a little late to the party on this book because I saw clown in a cornfield and it was billed to me as a slasher, and I'm like, okay, creepy clown. All right, cornfield. You got like the Stephen King Children of the. Oh, you're just kind of doing like keywords that work well in horror, but it all makes sense why it's all together, and it gels really well.
We live in that, one of these sort of weird, what's the word for it? The fact that we have all these haunted corn mazes and all the Knights of Columbus and the Kiwanis Club people are out there scaring the heck out of kids in in hay wagons for fun. We understand that. It's part of our culture. John, I know this book won the Bram Stoker Award. Could we just pause for a second and just say what that award is?
Sure. So the Bram Stoker Award is the award associated with the Horror Writers Association, of which I am a member. So it is a horror genre specific award given across various categories. I believe this was the winner in the young adult category. And it is books chosen by horror readers and writers for horror readers and writers. So they will sometimes put out lists of recommendations, or a lot of times, even just looking through the nominees is also a great place to find quality horror content.
Good to know. So we've had our slasher novel. Can you tell us about Cackle by Rachel Harrison, which strikes a different vibe?
Oh, definitely. I was recently turned on to the phrase or a new subgenre of cozy being a subgenre. This has been billed as cozy horror. I'll start with the synopsis, and I think you'll see what I mean. All right. Cackle. All her life, Annie has played it nice and safe. After being unceremoniously dumped by her longtime boyfriend, Annie seeks a fresh start. She accepts a teaching position that moves her from Manhattan to a small village upstate. She's stunned by how perfect and picturesque the town is. The people are all friendly and warm. Her new apartment is dreamy too, minus the oddly persistent spider infestation. Then Annie meets Sophie, beautiful, charming, magnetic Sophie, who takes a special interest in Annie, who wants to be her friend. More importantly, she wants Annie to stop apologizing and start living for herself. That's how Sophie lives. Annie can't help but gravitate toward the self-possessed Sophie, wanting to spend more and more time with her, despite the fact that the rest of the townsfolk seem a little afraid of her. And okay, there are some things. Sophie's appearance is uncanny and ageless. Her mansion in the middle of the woods feels a little unearthly. And she does seem to wield a certain power, but she couldn't be. Could she? So that is Cackle. So I'm sure you could hear from the synopsis. The setup it feels like a Hallmark movie. The story picks up on Annie's 30th birthday, just a couple months after she's been dumped by her boyfriend of 10 years. Moves upstate. And you expect like the Hallmark movie. She'll meet a rustic, attractive man with a mysterious past or something. But instead, the story is it's the story of Annie coming into her own through the lens of this friendship with Sophie. And like I said, with the cozy subgenre, there's a lot of description of really good food and like cozy sweaters. As far as how scary this book is, there was a few moments. It is definitely still a horror novel, but for the most part, it's very cozy and comfy. I could see somebody almost watching this as their comfort movie, or someone would have no problem reading this in bed. In fact, parts of it are very, funny and comfortable and really enjoyable. But it's really the story of Annie learning to choose herself and not basing her life on a relationship, whether that is a relationship with her ex, or her relationship even with her new friend or the other people around town.
Yeah.
One thing that I really enjoyed in this also, just as an educator, is I'm not sure if Rachel Harrison was ever an educator, but it's one of the few books I've read that really tackles the strange little behind the scenes work of being a teacher. And there's one scene where she comes home from cleaning up her new classroom that she inherited from a teacher who retired, and just talking about how the water that goes down the shower drain is gray almost after. Like, oh yeah, no, they don't tell you about that.
But, reading your synopsis and the description, the idea that people upstate are a little bit afraid of her, and that Sophie seems too good to be true, and it's such an important thing that I think young people face, is this sense of belonging and finding your place, and sometimes finding yourself means stepping out of place. So this one has me really curious about both Annie and Sophie.
Oh yeah, they're both very well developed characters. One might have a little bit more going on supernaturally than the other, but it's still your relationship with the people around town based on reputation, based on their past, and again, relationships. So is it controlling that this person calls me when we don't hang out one weekend just because I had something else going on? A lot of things in our discourse nowadays, we're talking about setting clear boundaries, whether those are work home life boundaries or relationship boundaries. That is a theme that gets explored a lot in this book, which, again, interesting that Rachel Harrison chose the character Annie to be an educator, because I feel like educators in particular struggle with boundary setting. When are you working and when are you not working, and all of that.
Absolutely. And what I'm loving about these titles is they all, and like your novels, set in a world we can identify, and just pushing and exploring where our boundaries, psychological, emotional, supernatural, who knows. I think we're stepping in that direction with My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. I'm especially interested in this one because it's set in the 80s, which was when I was coming through high school. So could you tell us about that one, John?
The book is very 80s, and not in it's very authentically 80s. There's dress up Decades Day 80s, and then there's what the 80s actually was, and it really does that. So, My Best Friend's Exorcism. Abby and Gretchen have been best friends since 5th grade, when they bonded over a shared love of E.T., roller skating parties, and scratch and sniff stickers. But when they arrive at high school, things change. Gretchen begins to act different, and as the strange coincidences and bizarre behavior start to pile up, Abby realizes there's only one possible explanation. Gretchen, her favorite person in the world, has a demon living inside her, and Abby is not about to let anyone or anything come between her and her best friend. With help from some unlikely allies, Abby embarks on a quest to save Gretchen, but is their friendship powerful enough to beat the devil? It's hilarious. First of all, Grady Hendrix is the master of horror comedy, in my opinion, of people writing today. I mean, this was the first book I read by him, but he also has Horror Store, which is basically about a haunted IKEA, and that's all about consumerism and work culture. But this is really about friendship and their relationship. What the synopsis doesn't go into is that these girls go to they live in South Carolina, one of the Carolinas, and they go to a private Catholic school, and they live in sort of a neighborhood where you're expected to act and look and behave a certain way. And our main character, Abby, she is there on a scholarship, so she kind of feels like, okay, well, that's strikes 1 and 2 there. I really have to act a certain way. And the way Gretchen begins behaving after Well, this isn't a spoiler. It happens very early in the book. They say, okay, we're going to go up to so-and-so's cabin and we're going to try doing acid.
Okay.
Teenagers in the 80s, these things happen. At first, they think, okay, Gretchen had a bad trip. She's maybe feeling a little weird from that. There's some, at first, Abby maybe thinks that, maybe she ran into some guy in the woods and maybe she was assaulted. And again, putting a certain image of what your family should look and act like. Her parents don't want to hear that because, not my daughter. But Abby has to really stick by her friend, despite the fact that Gretchen's behavior during all this is really pushing everyone, including Abby, away. And it's really about the power of their friendship. And there was recently a movie put out of this on Amazon Prime. I thought it was really good and fun, but one thing that they left out is the epilogue of this book. It makes everyone who reads it cry. It's like their friendship, and if you've ever had a lifelong relationship with someone, and talking about how friendships change and how you come in and out of each other's lives over the years, it could be so relatable, and it's deeply moving. So Grady Hendrix can really get you there as far as comedy and horror in those. It's funny how those two genres are all about eliciting a physical reaction.
Right.
You want a scare or you want to laugh. And I recently listened to an interview with Grady Hendrix where they kind of asked how he does that. And a lot of times he said it's very simple, that sometimes he just injects a little bit of reality into into very unearthly situations. So I don't think it's a spoiler to say that there's an exorcism scene in this book. And somebody like, I need to have a protein shake first. It's like, excuse me? But I was like, okay, well, I guess, we all have bodies and we have to keep them going. But yeah, this is a really good one as far as, a book about friendship, and it's very funny, but it's also there are parts of this book that are genuinely frightening. So Grady Hendrix is really good at having horror and comedy without sacrificing either. I find a lot of times horror comedy, it's primarily one or the other, but he really rides that line very, very well.
Right. So often it can be horror in the service of comedy. It's just like a trapping. So John, these are incredible books. And I know your next book that you want to talk about is an inclusive anthology that gives people exposure to underrepresented authors. Can you tell us about that collection?
It's called Other Terrors, an inclusive anthology. This is actually put out by the Horror Writers Association. And I'll just read a portion of the official synopsis because it was kind of long, which with that many authors and that many stories, it's going to be. In Other Terrors, horror writers from a multitude of underrepresented backgrounds have created stories of everyday people, places, and things where something shifts, striking a deeper, much more primal chord of fear. Are our eyes playing tricks on us, or is something truly sinister lurking under the surface of what we thought we knew? And who among us is really the other after all? So this is a collection of short stories by several authors. Some of them actually are authors on this list. Others are up-and-comers. But again, all authors from underrepresented communities. And a lot of the stories kind of touch on that thematically. So I think not only is this collection a great way to get sort of, I almost imagine it as at a restaurant, if you get the appetizer sampler platter, like a little bit of everything. And it's also just a great way to get to know more horror authors. So you could think, oh, I really liked that short story. Maybe let's see what else they've written. But again, it also touches on themes that are very relevant in our world, especially people who are considered the other, which I've seen and discussed with a lot of people, how a lot of times people who have felt othered in some way or another have kind of gravitated to the horror community, which, like we've talked about before, it is a very welcoming community. And I think it's because a lot of us know what it feels to be the other, or just to at least be seen as it. So, I mean, there's a ton of stories by a lot of authors. We could do a whole episode just talking about this anthology, so I'm not going to go too deep on it. But it is put out by the Horror Writers Association, and it's a great variety and different types of horror too. So if you're really not sure what you're into, this is a great way to kind of narrow that down a little bit more.
I'm imagining too, if a group of friends got the collection together, that it could really ignite some really interesting conversations about how the different stories within the collection speak to the same themes and experiences of what it means to be alive.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, these again, these, they're considered genre fiction, but they have deep themes, and even though they are short stories, they pack a punch as far as that goes, which I know we're going to talk about that later, but there's a lot to be done.
Why don't we move along and jump into Unfortunate Elements of My Anatomy by Haley Piper?
Okay, first of all, my favorite title of a single author anthology ever. So I will start with the synopsis. Love twisted into horrific shapes, nightmares driven by cruel music, and a world where what little light remains fractures the sky into midnight rainbows in 18 stories tracing the dark veins of queer horror, isolation, and the monstrous feminine. The universe unwinds to the tune of a malicious ice cream truck in a malicious ice cream truck jingle in We All Scream. The law of conservation of death dictates that a ghost pursue his prey across her every reincarnation. Superstitions thrive even in the distant future and across the stars when a colony shuttle mounts a witch trial in Harry Jack, and try to forgive the adoring beast as it scavenges a world of dead gods for tokens of bloody affection. Including 2 new short stories and a never-before-published novelette, Unfortunate Elements of My Anatomy digs deep inside and clings to the beating nightmare heart that you always knew was there. So this is Haley Piper, an author who she has a ton of stuff coming out right now. She's part of that wave of horror authors. I believe Esquire magazine just did a big article on the new voices of the new generation of horror writing. Haley Piper's in there. And another thing she did was brought the novella. She wasn't alone in this, but I know for a long time, people were saying, oh, nobody wants to publish a novella because nobody wants to buy a novella. Why would you spend X number of dollars for something you could read in 1 or 2 sittings? And Haley Piper, among others, proved that is just abjectly false. People love novellas. One thing that I really like about this as a single author collection is it really shows Haley Piper's range as well as themes that she returns to. And again, it connects with deeper themes and ideas that we can really have some great conversations exploring. I think one of my favorites in the collection was the law of conservation of death. So again, it is a ghost haunting a woman across multiple reincarnations of herself.
Oh boy. Long term.
Right. And it really mirrors an abusive relationship, that maybe that relationship that you just can't get away from. And it also does that very practical thing that I think a lot of ghost stories are doing now, because a lot of people are saying, well, why wouldn't you just move out of the haunted house? So now a lot of times, well, it's not the house that's haunted, it's you as a person. And in this story, it's, well, you could even die and doesn't matter, you're still haunted by this. And again, it really mirrors being a survivor of abuse and how sometimes those relationships are very hard to escape from. And even just dealing with it after you've escaped from it could be a process.
You know, John, as you were describing those themes in this short story collection, I'm thinking of the Portrait of Dorian Gray, Jane Eyre, even Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. You know, so this is an example of a collection that has a history, right? Has a family history as a text. And what an interesting thing to think about those canonical texts in a new light, given how these contemporary writers, and this one in particular, are exploring these ideas. You know, some of our problems aren't particularly new.
Right. And, you know, I remember one short story, I forget the title of this particular one, but the main character of that story was trans and it just very accurately just described like the whole like public bathroom. Like this person is going to the bathroom and just the whole like this, I could be taking my life in my hands right now just by existing in a public space. And it's just so intimately written that you really feel it. That's just as frightening as anything supernatural that happens in it. So there's a lot of ground covered in this book.
You have me definitely intrigued. So we've had two collections that people can pick up and sample and put those ideas in conversation in their own heads and talk to other people about. Tell us about Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones.
All right, Mongrels. He was born an outsider like the rest of his family, poor yet resilient. He lives in the shadows with his Aunt Libby and Uncle Darren, folk who stubbornly make their way in a society that does not understand or want them. They are mongrels, mixed blood, neither this nor that. The boy at the center of Mongrels must decide if he belongs on the road with his aunt and uncle, or if he fits in with the people on the other side of the tracks. For 10 years, he and his family have lived a life of late-night exits and close calls, always on the move across the South to stay one step ahead of the law. But the time is drawing near when Darren and Libby will know if their nephew is like them or not, and the close calls they've been running from for so long are catching up fast. Now everything is about to change. Something that I think is really interesting in this synopsis, they didn't use the word werewolf once, but this is a werewolf book. But just as much as it is a werewolf book, it is a book about rural poverty and about, and it's a coming of age novel. You know, so our protagonist, he is growing up, and in the werewolf lore of this particular book, you know, he is getting to the age where he's either going to change or he's not. And that's going to kind of dictate what the rest of his life looks like. So it's really that figuring out who he is, and also, like I said, a lot of themes of rural poverty and otherness. I actually noticed, I felt a lot of parallels between this book and Sherman Alexie's The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. But anyhow, it's there's a lot of parallels with that, where he and his family kind of live a nomadic lifestyle, and a lot of times it's because Uncle Darren will get into some sort of a trouble, or maybe a bar fight went a little far, and okay, we've got to leave town until nobody cares about this anymore. And just little things like that, it's the little details, like what their living conditions look like. Okay, well, we've got the screen door kind of hanging off the hinges, and it's written in such a very authentic way where it's not overly done or cartoony, and as dysfunctional as the family may be, sometimes they do genuinely care about one another. There's a lot of tough love, and sometimes people just genuinely doing their best, but maybe their best isn't what we'd hope it would be. So yeah, I just really like this book because it's so many things at once, but it's also so intimately written. It's the story of growing up, but just through the lens of werewolves.
That's neat, and I'm thinking that's interesting that the theme of rural poverty comes through in a couple of these texts, and then you to step out of horror, for sure, Sherman Alexie and that old chestnut, To Kill a Mockingbird. And
Oh yeah, for sure.
and I'm just thinking of the big essential question there. Is it possible to change? Is there a point at which we can change? To use that question to consider the characters in any of these books or any of these non-horror books would really make for some really great conversations. But I remember when I was in elementary school reading a series of mysteries, the Trixie Belden series, and all the characters were from upper middle class families. Every kid had a car, this kind of thing. And I thought they were great. I just loved the adventures. And I remember my elementary school librarian reading one of my books and giving it back to me and saying that she just couldn't relate because all the kids were rich. And those were the 70s. And I was not a rich kid, but I wasn't reading with that critical thought process in mind. And I think texts that help readers become aware of economic diversity as well are very important.
Oh, definitely. And it's not, and that's one thing that I like about the way horror sometimes handles it, is it's part of the story. Yes, that is what the book is about, but it also has, this plot of, is he going to become a werewolf when he gets to a certain age, and all that. And I guess you could even say, outside of a coming of age story, this could also be an allegory for puberty.
Right.
and any other, lots of other forms of identity in there, which is interesting because I didn't put this one on the list, but just because I haven't read it yet. It's sitting on my nightstand right now. But Rachel Harrison, who wrote Cackle, she wrote a werewolf novel called Such Sharp Teeth, and it's been described to me as just a very feminist werewolf novel.
Oh,
and there's
cool.
a lot of parallels there, and I'm really excited to read that one.
That sounds good too. Thinking about that Little Red Riding Hood. So tell us about The Fisherman by John Langan. Where does that take us?
Okay, so John Langan is often described as the literary horror guy, which is, I don't love that term, just because I think every book we've discussed today is literature. And I think this really comes from a long-standing tradition of, even thinking back in, Victorian England, where there's the Christmas tradition of telling ghost stories, but they're just kind of seen as, oh, that's not literature. Like, excuse me, you're going to tell me A Christmas Carol and The Canterville Ghost aren't literature? And then sort of like the pulp novels of the 20s and 30s being sort of shelved as, oh, this isn't literature. That's, junk food for your brain. But then, if you go back and read all of those that were billed as kind of trash at the time, there's a lot to it. So I think there's just been a long-standing tradition of the genre kind of getting that bad rep. And I've found mostly from people who have read little to no horror.
Right.
Or what little they have, they'll often say, oh, well, that doesn't count. Because if you say, oh, this is, what do you mean? Oh, no, the Christmas Carol? Oh, it's a classic of literature. It's a ghost story.
Right.
So anyhow, The Fisherman by John Langan. In upstate New York, in the woods around Woodstock, Dutchman's Creek flows out of the Ashokan Reservoir, steep-banked, fast-moving. It offers the promise of fine fishing and of something more, a possibility too fantastic to be true. When Abe and Dan, two widowers who have found solace in each other's company and a shared passion for fishing, hear rumors of the creek and what might be found there, the remedy to both their losses, they dismiss it as just another fish story. Soon enough, the men find themselves drawn into a tale as deep and old as the reservoir. It's a tale of dark pacts, of long-buried secrets, and of a mysterious figure known as Der Fischer, the fisherman. It will bring Abe and Dan face to face with all that they have lost and the price they must pay to regain it. My friend, best man at my wedding, he actually bought me this book because we are fishing buddies. And the title of the first chapter is How Fishing Saved My Life. And again, it's the story of two widowers, one of whom he is older, sort of maybe the age you'd expect a widower to be. and the other is a guy, I think he's in his 30s, and he just lost his whole family in I think a car accident. It's one thing I will say that this book does, it's just one of the most haunting tales of grief that I've ever read. And it's how finding something like finding fishing saved both of them. The guy, one of them was just kind of sitting on his couch. He'd go to work and sit on his couch and go to work, and just kind of was leading a very depressing existence. And then he found fishing, and it kind of saved him. And then he saw that in his friend, well, in the other widower, who he then struck up a friendship with. And then a big chunk of this book is, I almost hesitate to call it a flashback, because it's at least half of the book is this flashback narrative of turn of the century America, a lot of immigrant families coming in from across Europe. I mean, they said Der Fischer, that's German for the fisherman. It's a story of people who have lost loved ones and family members, possibly being able to have that person back, but at what cost, and is it truly them? It really pulls in two directions. It's such an intimate, close story, but it's also very cosmic and just vast. And there's a lot of literary allusions here. So there's a ton of Moby Dick in this book. I think there might even be, like, From Hell's Heart I Stab at Thee. Mm-hmm. That might even be quoted in there. And I guess it is that white whale, that's something that you want more than anything. These two widowers would give anything to see their wives, and in one case their children again, and it sort of consuming them. And at what cost? At any cost, sort of like in Moby Dick. There's also the classic fish story of that big fish that got away. There's, I don't want to give too much away with this, but there's also a lot of references to the Leviathan. So,
oh boy,
yeah, and you're thinking, hold on, this isn't like in a little creek in upstate New York, but that's when it becomes very otherworldly. And yeah, it's not like Jaws, where there's just, okay, that's a shark, and it just happens to be a really big, really mean one. There's something else going on here. There's the fisherman, or Der Fischer, in the flashback part of it is, he knows things that people shouldn't know. So it's got that classic forbidden knowledge. And again, it kind of dangles a hook in front of our characters. It's that bait that they want more than anything.
It's making me think of Neil Gaiman's The Ocean at the End of the Lane in some ways.
Yeah, it's like a little pond, but it's an ocean. And yeah, there's the ocean at the end of the lane. Man, that's one of my favorites. And how there's characters who maybe on the surface might just seem like a fairly mundane person, but oh wait, there's a lot more going on here. John Langan does a really good job of that. And if anybody is looking for more literary horror, which again, I think all of this is, but John Langan also has a bunch of collections of short stories that I really enjoy, and there's a lot of that in there. So if you are a literature person and you want to get those references and all that, you can, it's definitely in there. In his collection, The Wide Carnivorous Sky, I believe it's called, there's a whole short story that's about a professor teaching The Mask of the Red Death to a literature class, and then things go a certain way. You can't really say much about a short story without completely ruining it. But there's a lot out there by John Langan if that is your thing. Yeah, a lot of people have found it very enjoyable, even if they're like, I didn't really understand the whole From Hell's Heart I Stab at Thee. Like, why is he talking like that? But I don't know, it was good. It really can occupy both worlds. And
those intertextual references can be very satisfying for people who pick up on them, and then it's fine if they don't. Would you say that's for a somewhat older audience, John, or what are your thoughts about the age range for that?
I'd say it's definitely written for adults. But I would say anybody who's experienced loss could find a lot of value in it. Like I said, the two widowers in it, one of them is older, the age you would expect a widower to be, and the other guy is probably about my age. And I really think a lot of people could get a lot out of this book, but I'd say it would probably lean a little older.
I imagine a younger person, maybe not having encountered those classical texts, would make the connection later. You can always, it's a little bit like reading Shakespeare. So, yeah, now I get it. Now I see it. Let's bring it to our grand finale here with Come Closer by Sarah Gran. What's that one about?
Okay, Come Closer from Sarah Gran. All right, I'll start with the synopsis. A recurrent, unidentifiable noise in her apartment. A memo to her boss that's replaced by obscene insults. Amanda, a successful architect in a happy marriage, finds her life going off kilter by degrees. She starts smoking again. And one night, for no reason, without even the knowledge that she's doing it, she burns her husband with a cigarette. At night, she dreams of a beautiful woman with pointed teeth on the shore of a blood-red sea. The new voice in Amanda's head, the one that tells her to steal things, to talk to strange men in bars, is strange and frightening, and Amanda struggles to wrest back control of her life. Is she possessed by a demon, or is she simply insane? So, Come Closer, I believe it would qualify as a novella. It's like 160 pages. And one thing that I think this novel does really well in the sort of possession subgenre is, first of all, it's not trying to be The Exorcist, which a big chunk of that subgenre is trying to do. It's much more in the character's head, and it starts in such a grounded way of just, I think we've all had that experience of moving into a new space and what is that weird noise? Is the house settling? Is it just this is the noise my new apartment makes? Okay. And it continues to your internal voice. So one of the first things that she does once she may or may not be possessed is she picks up smoking again. Well, is that an outside voice telling you to do that, or is that you saying, oh, you picked up your habit again? And little things like, she is, as it says in the synopsis, she's a very successful architect, and she likes a certain bauble that she sees at a work site, and she takes it. She doesn't need it. She can afford things, but she just wants it, so she takes it. And are you kind of giving into your own impulses, or is it coming from somewhere else? And it really teeters back and forth where the character and the reader aren't really sure what it is throughout the story. And it's very uncomfortable in a interesting way, and in a way that sticks with you. Like I said, it starts so grounded. Just, I wouldn't recommend reading this in a creaky old apartment, because you'll hear that tapping, and no, it can't be that. It starts with something that everybody can relate to, and just takes things further. So I think this is a really good one for somebody who, again, we all have that inner voice of, is this just some impulse? The thing I know I shouldn't do, but I really want to do. And it just takes it to another level, to another place, possibly from another place.
Well, it sounds it. And again, this sounds like something that might be more suitable for an older reader, would you say? Or
I definitely think somebody who is introspective and self-aware enough to question their own thoughts of, well, why is it that I do this? Or why do I have certain urges that I know I shouldn't have? So somebody who's very in their own head would definitely get a lot more out of this book, both from a horror perspective and from sort of a thematic character analysis.
It's making me think of the figure of speech that somebody's beside themselves or they're not themselves, and what does that mean, and how do we become at odds with our better selves, or our regular selves, I guess.
Right. And throughout the book, there's the whole exploration of different ways to seek help. So it's, well, do I go see a doctor? Do I, in this case, do I go to some sort of a church and talk to somebody? Do I just sit here and think a self-help book is enough? So it's also, how do we take care of ourselves and avoid, I guess now you could even say, how do I avoid something that looks like it's helping but could be hurting? There's a lot of disinformation in the world.
When we began this conversation, or when we began talking before the podcast, I was telling you that I was reading a review about this book in The Guardian from 2021. The reviewer talks about, harpies, doppelgangers, possession, once confined to horror writing, and now making their way into what the reviewer referred to as literature, again, making that distinction. And it sounds like this book does a pretty seamless job of, yes, that is literature, and these things exist, and these are motifs and literary devices that help us figure life out on a pretty deep level, and with literary merit.
Yeah, and again, I think all of these books do. I think I won't say all, but because that's a bold statement. But I think there's a lot in the horror genre that just gets overlooked from that perspective, just because it's not marketed that way. I think it could be a marketing thing. Actually, I think one reason that Sarah Grand might have gotten that recognition is because she is not typically a horror author. I mean, she writes like thrillers, much more grounded things like that. So that could have, I honestly think maybe reviewers maybe wouldn't have read this book otherwise, or wouldn't have read it with an open mind to that. So again, I think a big part of getting the literary value out of horror is simply giving it a chance and seeing what's out there with it, and reading it with an open mind. Like, yes, there are plot elements. There's a lot of things that happen in horror are very plot driven, but a lot of it's not. And one author that I didn't bring up, just because I was trying to stop this from being a multi-hour long episode, is Paul Tremblay. He is from Massachusetts, and he is very masterful when it comes to the unreliable narrator, and a lot of times never really having the answer. So his most recent book at the time of recording is called The Pallbearers Club, and that whole book is just about a multi-decade friendship between the main character, who is definitely appears to be sort of an author insert, and a young woman who may or may not be Mercy Brown, the New England vampire. But if you actually made just a bulleted list of what happens in the novel, it's a pretty short list. It's not plot driven at all. It's really just a character study. So I think a lot of folks might not even realize, no, this is something that horror does. We will just do an in-depth character study and just get in the character's head. So I think that's a big part of it. Again, marketing, and just the weird long-standing tradition that has existed for a very long time.
Absolutely, John. And I'm really happy that we've had this conversation, and I can put the list of books with links in the podcast notes, so that people who come to Woodbury Writes to find out more about you and your books will also find ways to get to these books. And I as a teacher and as a reader and somebody who likes to read everything, I'm just really excited to think with a different critical lens about how these books that you've identified as being good starting points into the genre of horror really are engaging their predecessors in the literary world through their themes and through their characters and the challenges the characters face. And what I think is also interesting is to say, okay, so how did this writer in 1960, say Harper Lee, explore rural poverty? And how does that stand up against these other horror novels that look at rural poverty? Are there common threads? Are they very different? And what it really comes down to is, how do we make sense of what it means to be human and walking this earth at a given time? I think these are tremendous gifts from writers who are not afraid to be candid in their exploration about the things that really do weigh on people's minds in our time.
Sure, and it's very ironic that we are discussing the sort of the literary allusions, references, and the connections, the strands of literary DNA that has gone down through this genre for a very long time, because I actually left a few books off the list that very directly allude to other literature. So I'm just gonna name drop those really quick. So there's the Winter Tide series by Ruth Anna Emrys. There's two novels and a short story currently in that series, and it is a sort of a response to H.P. Lovecraft's Shadow over Innsmouth. H.P. Lovecraft was a horrible racist even for the time that he's not just a guy who had the rotten luck of being born in the time that he lived in. Even if you look at some of his correspondence with other authors back then, even they were like, buddy, you really should tone it down. So what that story that this book series alludes to is, well, not alludes to, it kind of continues and moves it in a more productive direction. There's people called Deep Ones. Basically, they are fish. They're going to be fish people, and when they reach a certain age, they will turn into sort of anthropomorphic fish and go live in the ocean. And this the character maybe confronts the idea of, oh my God, what if I found out I was actually part that, which definitely tied to Lovecraft's racist ideas. But Ruth Anna Emrys took that and said, okay, well, what would happen next, and how can we move this in a better direction? So a lot of what happens in that story is a lot of the Deep Ones get moved into, for lack of a better word, concentration camps. And Ruth Anna Emrys coupled that with the Japanese internment camps that happened just a few years later. And when they were all released together, well, how does somebody with that lineage exist in the world, and how can you live in and support a country that literally imprisoned you and most of your family and friends from your culture and your background died as a result? Because there's, again, this isn't spoiling anything. Basically, the main character, Afra, is approached by an FBI agent saying, we know some of that stuff you do. And in the book, magic is kind of, some people see it as very, very advanced mathematics. Some people see it more akin to prayer. And they say, oh, well, we found out that there's a way that someone could put their consciousness in another person's body. We want to make sure the Russians don't do that and, start World War III, or, launch the big one. So they ask this person who has been disenfranchised, imprisoned, and mistrusted by their country to basically work in service of their country. And how do you do that? And that's it. And it moves things in very interesting ways. And that is a direct response to us, some older stories that I purposely didn't include on the list, because I feel like you don't have to have read the earlier works, but it is very closely tied to it.
Got it.
So it's just interesting that idea goes even deeper, and it came up so many times on a list where I was actually purposely trying to avoid those sort of things. I wanted something that was absolutely accessible to everyone, but really interesting how it's there.
John, I'm really grateful to you for doing the research and putting the list together and having this conversation today. And I hope our listeners will avail of these resources. I'm enlightened, and now I have a book list. So thanks.
Happy to help.